back tonight since that's where everybody likes to sit. Renee, I'm going to warn you, I'm going to pull this podium down here.
Okay, you're going to come back
Closer.
farther?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm going to come back there.
Come back at least this far, that way I don't feel like I'm having to yell at everybody. First thing I want to do is I want to apologize to everyone this morning. I was so discombobulated whenever that my notes were gone that I actually read Romans 12 instead of 1 Corinthians 12, but I'm glad I see nodding heads. And it's good to be able to laugh at yourself, because I guarantee you the first time you get up in front of somebody to speak, you're going to start making mistakes.
That's right.
If you can't laugh at yourself, you might as well cry, because that's what's going to happen. Along with those same stories, I want to tell you a story about when I was a missionary. And this is one where you're going to laugh, because I laugh now. I laughed when it happened. We pulled into a gas station, and in Venezuela, where we were, whenever you pulled into a gas station, you could expect your car to be mobbed by, usually it was little kids, sometimes teenagers, and they'd run out there with a bottle of water and a rag, and they'd want to wash your windshield. And the question would be, lavo el vidrio, do I wash the glass? And my car was pretty dirty, because I lived out in the plains. All the roads were always dusty in the dry season and muddy in the rainy season. And so I told the guys I was filling up with gas. He said, lavo el vidrio. I said, sí, y el trasero también. And in other words, and the back glass too. But the word trasero in Venezuelan Spanish can also mean derriere. And he looked at me, and I looked at him, and I said, el vidrio trasero. He said, that's good, because I don't wash backsides. So you got to be able to laugh at yourself. If you don't have a sense of humor, when you mess up, you're just going to cry. And so I messed up this morning, but you were smart enough to figure it out and go follow along with me. I really meant 1 Corinthians chapter 12. So you go back and read those verses. Now tonight, we're not going to be jumping all over the place. It ought to be pretty easy. So just turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 7, and we're going to pick it up with a very familiar passage of Scripture, starting in verse 24. Now, one of the things that I want you to recognize here is Matthew 5, 6, and 7 are what are commonly referred to as the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus' first public sermon is probably his most famous sermon, and he wraps it up in a way that maybe would be good for us to look at as well. So, as we do that, though, let's pray, because God can even cover up our faux pas and help us to get past that and get to what he wants us to hear. Lord, as we come to you again this evening, once again, no one needs what I have to say, but we all need what you have to say. So, Lord, hide me behind the cross and help your words be spoken in spite of me. Lord, I pray that you would use me and you speak through me, but Lord, you just make sure that you speak, because we need a word from you. Help us now in Jesus' precious name. Amen. Let's go ahead and read Matthew chapter 7, starting in verse 24. Now you've got to remember, let's back up and look starting in verse 22. That many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons and perform many miracles? And then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. Now verse 24. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the winds blew against it and beat against that house, and yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, and the streams rose, and the winds beat against that house, but it fell with a great crash. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority, not as their teachers of the law. Now, why would Jesus end with a parable? Why would he end with, a parable is really a story, a simple story with a big lesson. And Jesus ended his greatest sermon by telling them a story about a foolish builder and a wise builder. Now, probably one of the greatest examples of foolishness, foolish construction is one of the wonders of the world. How many of you have ever heard of the Leaning Tower of Pisa? Okay? In 1174, the Italian architect Bonanno Pisa, and I didn't say Bonanza Pisa, Bonanno Pisano, began work on what became the most famous project. It was a separately standing 8-story bell tower. Okay, just a bell tower, straight up, easy, right? Only problem was Pisano did not dig down far enough and hit bedrock when he built his tower. He built it, shall we say, on the shifting sands. Did you know that at one point the Leaning Tower of Pisa lead the opposite direction? They've gone in and they've tried to shore it up. It'll lead this way, it'll lead that way. Every time they try to do something, it just keeps shifting. And experts have said that this thing will one day fall because it is not built on solid rock. I mean, they have tried everything. It's tilted, and finally, now, even though it took them 176 years to build that tower, it's still shifting. It's still leaning, and I think they said it was 18 feet off of center. Now, that means if you're up in the top, you're looking straight down, you're 18 feet off of the base of the tower is where you're looking. That's a long ways. I mean, that would be probably about as far as from here to that wall off center. And so, you know, you get something leaning like that, you know, this is what, a 10-foot view? You get something, let's say, let's come here. This will be about 18 feet to that wall. That's a long ways to fall. That's a long ways for it to be off. And you ever hear something called the center of gravity? You ever see a car or maybe a farm tractor that is turned over because its center of gravity got tilted too far over? That's exactly what's going on here. Now, why? He was trying to build a straight tower. They have tried for nearly 800 years now to straighten this thing. And they can't do it because it's not built on the firm foundation. Engineers today will tell you that it doesn't matter how far you have to go down. If you're going to build something that's tall, you have to go to the bedrock. You have to go to the bedrock. And Pisano didn't do that. Maybe it was way too far. Maybe the bedrock's way too deep. I don't know why they didn't do that. But you can pour all the concrete you want to pour. It's just not going to work. There's another example of some foolish construction in Venezuela. It's called the Cathedral of Our Lady of Coromoto. Now, Coromoto is a word that is not really a Venezuelan word. It's an indigenous Indian word, or so the Catholic priest who began to tell the story says it is. So, but supposedly there was an apparition of the Virgin Mary who appeared to an Indian chief named Coromoto out in the swamps. And he told him that you need to go and embrace the white man's religion. And so he goes into town, takes several of his tribal people with him. They go into town, and they all get baptized Catholic. Well, he sees that it's not really what he thought it was, and it's not all this stuff, so he decides to go back to the swamp. And in the swamp, he gets bitten by a poisonous snake. And then Mary appears to him again and says, if you don't convert back to Catholicism, you're going to die. If you do, you'll be healed. So according to the story, according to the legend, he converts back to Catholicism and is healed. Okay? Only problem with that, I had a friend who was a historian for the state of Guanare, state of Portuguesa, and in the city of Guanare. And he did a lot of research. That's where this cathedral is built. There was no Indian chief named Coromoto. There was no Indian tribe named Coromoto. The farthest he could trace it back was to the 1930s, where there was a Catholic priest who was discouraged over the low attendance in his church, and all of a sudden they began circulating this story, and attendance picked up. Now, you make of that what you want to. The thing that they did out there is the government came in, and the Vatican had decided that, okay, we're going to make this Virgin of Coromoto the patron saint of Venezuela. And so Pope John Paul II was coming to Venezuela to rededicate this place. Well, the only problem was the place this apparition was out in the swamp. Well, they wanted a proper cathedral out there. And so they spent $1 billion. Yeah, that's right. One with 9 zeros after it. And they built a 4-lane highway 16 miles off into this swamp, and they built a 300-foot tall spire on top of this huge cathedral. Inside the cathedral, you've got a tall ceiling in here, but inside that one, it's over 80 feet tall to the ceiling. Okay, it's huge. And they don't build out of wood and frame construction because the bugs are so bad. The ants, you think you got ant problems, you got to try the ants they've got down there. The termites are down there, they're thick, so they build out of concrete block. Well, the only problem is you put that much weight on the ground in the swamp, you can't get down to bedrock. They couldn't get down to bedrock, so they built what they called a floating foundation. Now, I studied a little bit of engineering, and I had to do some research on that because I didn't know what a floating foundation was either. It's a foundation that is twice as wide as the building it supports. In other words, it's like you put wings on the thing so that it can't sink, and it's supposed to help hold up the weight. So they did this. So out in the middle of the swamps in Venezuela is this cathedral with a 300-foot steeple on it that the only people that go there are the ones making a pilgrimage for Catholicism. And Renee will appreciate this. In order to pay for it, to get that $1 billion, they withheld teachers' salaries for a year. They withheld government workers' salaries for a year. Yeah, that's good, right? And they still don't have a solid foundation. Foolishness. Yeah, we shake our heads at that, we cluck our tongues at that, and we stop and wonder why in the world would they do something like that? Why would they build the Leaning Tower of Pisa with no foundation where it leans this way and that way? Why would they build a cathedral out in the middle of a swamp where they couldn't possibly get down to the bedrock? And so they build this floating foundation. And no one's sure how long it's going to last. They hope it's going to be there a long time. But there's a lot of questions about that type of foundation. So Jesus wraps all of his Sermon on the Mount up, his most famous sermon, by talking about the need for a firm foundation. And that's what he's been telling them. If we look at the Sermon on the Mount starting in chapter 5, we see the Beatitudes. We see Jesus talking about salt and light. We see him doing an explanation of the commandments. We see him talking about how to give, how to pray, the right handling of your possessions, how to avoid temptation, seeking God's kingdom first to avoid anxiety, do not be judgmental. He talks about 2 gates and 2 paths. He talks about asking, seeking, and knocking. And instead of wrapping up his sermon with a poem like a lot of modern day preachers, he tells this story about the need for a firm foundation, and he gives you a test. He says, he who hears these words of mine, and then comes the test. Because you see, they all heard the words of Jesus. They all were there when he preached about all that other stuff. And he said, he who hears these words of mine and takes heed of them. What's it say here in this one? It says, therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. You know, the test is this. How many houses got hit by the storms in this story? 1 or 2? How many? Both of them. All right? How many people in this story built good houses? Both of them built good houses, but how many of them had a good foundation? Only one. Okay? The wise person who listens to Jesus' words is like the wise man who builds his house on the rock. Now, for all we know, we don't know the names of these builders. For all we know, they could have had 2 identical truckloads of materials that they picked up at Lowe's, or if you want to make it local, they picked it up here at McCoy's. They had them delivered on site. They set it all off. The stacks were the same. The cost was the same. The materials were the same. Everything was the same. But then they start the construction, and one man goes out there and he just lays out his foundation area. He starts digging in the sand a little bit. He sets some posts. He tamps those posts in because he knows it needs to be pretty solid. Tamps it into the sand, puts it all back up, and then the next day he's starting to lay blocks, lay brick. The other guy is still up there with a chisel and a hammer and chipping away at the rock. The second day, the guy is about half done with his brick. The guy's still chipping. Third day, the other one's up there. About got his walls up, still chipping. Then he puts in the windows and the doors, still chipping. Puts on the roof, still chipping. Finally, as he's painting his house, the other guy starts laying his first foundational block. Well, what happens when you have a brand new house? I don't know about here, but in Venezuela especially, if somebody gets a brand new house, they'll have a housewarming. They'll party. I can just imagine that guy up there on the rock, still working, maybe using the same set of blueprints that the other guy had, building the same shaped house, everything. And yet he sees down there below him, they're having a party, celebrating. He's already done, and the other guy's just barely getting started. Keeps going. But then things change, because then the wind starts to blow, and the clouds start building up, and the rains start coming, and the floodwaters start to rise. See, the house built on the sand didn't have a foundation. So what happens when water runs across sand? You ever done that? I put, when I was doing this was a kid's story, I put some sand in a cake pan and poured water on it, and it just cuts a nice little trench right through there as you tip it. Well, what about when the wind starts to blow? And I don't want to do this in here because it would make a huge mess. You set a fan up there in front of that. You ever heard of blow sand? I lived out in the Panhandle for 3.5 years. They have blow sand out there. I mean, it'll all pile up. Sand dunes. Just outside of Beaver, there's Little Sahara, and then that's sand dunes, and they shift and they blow. Well, you build on that, and you don't have a foundation. When that begins to shift, what happens? We don't know, but it's possible that even before the storms came, that house that was built on the sand was starting to shift and settle. Maybe they were starting to get some cracks in the walls. We don't know that. Jesus doesn't tell us that. But he does tell us that it's really important. And he uses two words here. He uses the word phronimo, which is from the word we get our word prudent from. So the wise man is phronimo. He's prudent. He's thoughtful. He takes time and thinks things through. And then he uses the word for the other man, moros. Moros is the Greek word from which we get our word moron. He didn't just say he was foolish. He called him a moron. That's pretty harsh. No wonder these people said, hey, he's not teaching like our teachers of the law. I mean, standing up there in the pulpit, I just, hey, you morons, you better pay attention here. That wouldn't go over very well, would it? If this were in some place that had people that weren't as nice as you, you'd be throwing tomatoes at you. They wouldn't be ripe tomatoes, they'd be rotten tomatoes. You'd be booing, hissing, all kinds of stuff. People don't like being told that they're morons, but yet that's exactly what Jesus did. He said, if you don't pay attention and put into practice what I'm telling you, you're a bunch of morons. Well, how harsh can you get? And yet Jesus said that to get their attention because he knew just how important it is to have a firm foundation. There's a story that a friend of mine told about a man who was looking to buy a house. And because he had cash and not going to have a loan, he was wanting to get a nice house and do it quickly. Well, he told his realtor this, and he said, well, I know of a really nice looking house. I don't know why it hasn't sold. It's been on the market for some time. Let me see if I can get you a showing. So she arranges a showing, and they go over there. And the man's just impressed. This is exactly what he wants. The price is right. The house is beautiful. And he says, I would just like to have my brother come take a look at it, if that's all right with you, before I put down the money. Because this seems to be perfect. It seems everything I want. And his brother, who happened to be a building contractor, came over. And his brother walked in and said, yeah, it's a nice house. Let me see the basement. He said, I'm not going to be living in the basement. I don't care. I want to see the basement. Let's go down there. And went down there in that basement, and the blocks were cracking, and the cement was shifting, and everything had been braced up and shored up. He said, don't buy this house for love or money. It's coming down, and it's not going to wait too long to do it because it doesn't have a firm foundation. It seems perfect to him. And so many people on the surface, above the foundation, their life seems to be all together, and yet if you could go home with them, it could be that, like my mom used to say, I'd love to be a fly on the wall. I don't want to be a fly on the wall because at my house you get swatted. But if you do, or you're in there where you could just hear what goes on behind closed doors, you would find out that many times those people who seem to have it all together, their lives are a bigger mess than anybody else you know. But they're really good about covering it up. No matter how much lipstick you put on a pig, it's still a pig. Isn't that right? I mean, if I brought in a pig and I put a bunch of lipstick on there and said, hey guys, would you kiss this pig? Look at all the lipstick she's got on. You wouldn't want to kiss that pig, would you? I mean, even if you worked for Channel 6, you wouldn't want to kiss that pig. And they do. And it raises money. And the reason they do it is because it's something that nobody would do. And it's a funny thing. Until it's not. Until it comes down to the one who has to actually kiss the pig. You know, you see people, if we don't do what Jesus said, we're putting lipstick on a pig. We can come to church and we can memorize the sermons and everybody says, oh wow, how spiritual is that person? And then they go home and they throw stuff at their husband, or they yell at their wife, they use cuss words, or maybe they sneak off to the casino, they go to another town so nobody will know who they are. See, oh, that never happens. Hey, I've seen that happen even with Baptist preachers. The first convention that I went to in Los Angeles, I was still in college. I was working at Ford Glass up there in Tulsa. I had a lot more money than I did since. I could afford to pay my ticket, and my church said, hey, would you go as one of our messengers since you want to go anyway? Pastor happened to have me go with him. We got there, and you know what? About Thursday, the headlines in the Los Angeles Times were Baptist pastor caught in brothel. Wow. Isn't that wonderful? They thought just because they weren't in their hometown that they could sneak around and wouldn't get found out. Well, you might get away with it here. You might dress it up, and it might be the prettiest pig that ever had lipstick on. But it's still just a pig. And you cannot fool God, because God sees behind the lipstick. And so, as we are looking at this, Jesus said that if you listen to my words and apply what I'm telling you to your life, you're prudent, you're wise. But if you don't listen to my words, then you're being a moron. Wow. I still can't believe he called him that. And so, is a firm foundation really all that important? Absolutely. There was a story told about a young man who was in a shipwreck, and the ship capsized at sea during a storm. He was the only one to be rescued. They found him clinging desperately to a rock. And one of the men, the sailors who rescued him, said, were you terrified? He said, yes, I was absolutely terrified. I was shaking all the time, but the rock wasn't. You know, Jesus did not promise us that we would have a life without storms. I mean, how many people here can say you've lived through some storms in your life? I go from storm to storm to storm, it seems like. But Jesus will either take you through the storm or he will calm the storm. But their storms are going to come. You know, I want you to look at something here. Where did the adversity that these guys faced, where did these storms come from? They came from above. A lot of times when we say the bad things in life come, we say the devil did it. Not necessarily. If you look at this, these came from above. The rain fell, and it came from below. The floods came up, and it came from all sides. The wind blew. Who allowed all of that to happen? God did. Why do you think he allowed it to happen? Maybe he allowed it to happen to test not the house, but the foundation upon which it was built. To teach the builder a lesson that he would then turn. If he was being a moron, he would turn and become prudent. If he was being prudent, he wouldn't get proud of himself. He would simply say, the rock wasn't shaking. I was terrified, but this rock is solid. Jesus is that solid rock. And I think most of us here tonight know that. Maybe we forget it from time to time when the storms are beating on us, and we're terrified. I've got a good friend in Nebraska. His name is Al. His mother is just absolutely terrified of storms. So much so that, well, some of her behavior is not rational when storms happen. She gets panicked. And before we go pointing too many fingers out there, I bet we can find something in our own lives when we start looking that just terrify us as well. So let's not get too critical of her, but instead, when we think about those things that terrify us, we need to ask Jesus, Lord, help me attach this to the solid rock. So that when those things happen, I may be shaking all over, but the rock, Jesus Christ, isn't. Now, I suppose that those builders were both surprised by the storms. But Jesus wasn't surprised. You can't surprise God. COVID scared, shocked the world. God knew it was coming. He knew what was going to happen, who it was going to happen to, how long it was going to happen, and we'll probably have it forever, but he knows that, not me. There's nothing that you can say or do that is going to surprise God. Because he is, the fancy theological term for that is omniscient. He knows everything. Why then does he give us a choice? We talked about that this morning. Because he created us to love him and be loved by him. And you can't force that. He has to allow you the ability to be prudent. But that also means he allows you the ability to be a moron. And you get to decide which. So don't go blaming God. Say, God, how come you tore my house up? How come you didn't build it on a firm foundation? You know, Spurgeon, one of the greatest preachers of yesteryear, said, whether your religion be true or not, know this, it will be tried. Wow. You know, foundations, usually we don't see them until the storms happen. And then we find out real quick if we've got a good one or not. So, the next time you see a storm coming, don't say, all right, if I got a good foundation, we don't have to. Instead, turn to Jesus and say, you are my foundation. Help me to hang on to you. As you do that, you'll find that you have that peace and joy and hope that you thought you have it. And if your house comes down, Jesus will be right there with you every step of the way. A man by the name of Albert Barnes wrote a passage, he wrote about this in a Peter's commentary, Barnes Notes. And he said, the house built upon the sand is beat upon by the floods and the rains, and its foundation is gradually worn away until it is borne downstream and destroyed. So falls the sinner. The floods are wearing away his sandy foundation, and soon one tremendous storm shall beat upon him, and all his hopes shall fall forever. An eternal tempest shall beat around his naked soul, when all his emotions, when sinking forever in the flood, when he realizes that he is destined to live forever and ride in the peltings of that ceaseless storm. In other words, he's going to spend all eternity in the devil's hell. Why did Jesus try to wake them up by calling them morons? To keep them out of that storm. If he can wake us up, if he can get our attention, in order to change our direction and help us to build on a solid foundation. He can call me a moron all he wants if it wakes me up. My question to us is, what are we built on? You know, what's it going to take? The main point of this parable is that both men had the privilege of hearing Jesus' words. Both men had the privilege of getting the full benefit of his wisdom, and yet one listened to him and lived him out, and one chose not to. You know, we have a choice to love God or to not love God. We have a choice where we can determine to be wise or foolish. And that simply means whether or not we put our trust in God. How do you attach your life, which is symbolic of the house that we're talking about here, to the foundation, the rock, which is symbolic of Jesus? You simply put your trust in him. Not a little bit of it, not most of it, all of it. You know, the casinos love the term all or nothing. You're all in. Jesus is an all-in kind of God. When he hung on that cross, he was all in. He held nothing back. And when he says to these people, oh, didn't we do all these things in your name? He said, you weren't all in. You were playing games. You were holding something back. I don't really know you. Were they wise or were they foolish? Wise in their own eyes, perhaps, but foolish when it came down to it. I spoke with someone not too long ago about their sinful choices and their behavior, and I urged them to stop sinning and to do what was right. It grieved my heart when I heard the response. It went something like this: I don't know whether it's right or whether it's wrong. All I know is it's what I want to do, and I'm going to keep doing it. I think Jesus would have a word for that. Moron. If God shows you that something is wrong or something is right, you need to believe it, you need to do it. But in our generation, we don't like listening to anything that is not comfortable or convenient. As a matter of fact, if you ask people if there's such a thing as absolute truth, and we talked about this, I think, the last time I was here, they'll tell you that, oh, what's right for me is right for me, what's right for you is right for you. No, God determines what's right and what's wrong. He determines what the good foundation is and what the bad foundation is. He gives us the choice to follow his words, to put them into practice. That's our choice. We don't get to determine whether it is or it isn't. But unfortunately, like this guy that I was talking with, he said, I don't know if it's right or wrong, it's just what I want to do. Instead of asking what I want to do, maybe I need to be asking God, what do you want me to do? It's funny that if you ask people, especially in church, they'll say, oh yeah, I hear it and I put it into practice. You know, they're going to say, yeah, they do. But then when it comes right down to it, they don't. A man by the name of Thomas Brooks, and I'll start wrapping this up with this. He was a Puritan. And we don't talk like this anymore. We don't speak these words anymore, but I'm going to read it, and then we'll try to figure out what he's saying. He says, reader, remember this: if thy knowledge doth not now affect thy heart, it will at last, with a witness, afflict thy heart. Now, here's a paraphrase of that that'll maybe help us understand it. A man by the name of Eugene Peterson tried to modernize it. He says, but if you use my words in the Bible and don't work them into your life, you are like a stupid carpenter who built his house on a sandy beach. When the storms rolled in and the waves came up, the house collapsed like a house of cards. What do you suppose it means when he says that if you don't let knowledge affect your heart, that same knowledge will afflict your heart? It means that it's going to come back and bite you. It just is. What goes around comes around. If you're a parent, I urge you to lay down a deep foundation for your family. If you're a grandparent, see, I already did that with my kids. It either worked or it didn't. You got grandkids or maybe great-grandkids. It's not too late to have an influence in their life and help them dig a deeper foundation. You know, 12 miles off the coast of Scotland stands the Bell Rock Lighthouse. It's built on 1 acre of solid rock that sticks up out of the ocean. And it stood for over 200 years as the longest standing ocean-washed lighthouse. That means when the storms come through, it washes right over the top of it, but yet it still stands. You ever think how solid that rock must be? And yet, Jesus wants to be the solid rock in your life. Coming to church and hearing sermons is a great thing. I'm glad you're here. Coming to church and hearing sermons and then promptly ignoring them when you leave is a dangerous thing. Don't do it. You want to be wise. You want to be prudent. You don't want to be foolish. And you don't want to be called a moron. None of us do. It's our choice. I can't choose for you. You can't choose for me. But Jesus is knocking on our door and saying, what are you going to do today? Are you going to trust me? Or are you going to do what you want to do, even though it may be wrong? Good question. Hard to answer, but we need to answer it just the same. Let's pray. Father, life is full of so many choices. And the people who are gathered in this room,